Sue Bird is one of the most decorated athletes in her field. She's racked up 4 WNBA championships, 11 All-Star nods, more assists than anyone in the league's history, not to mention her 4 gold medals. But today we're going to hear about her activism and action off the court, which is proving to be her greatest legacy to the sport. She's not only been a tireless champion in the fight for equal pay, but now we'll hear more about her latest venture to change the dynamics and representation for women within sports and continue to level the playing field. Well, Sue, thanks so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
I want to start off because the equal pay discussion is so complex. Obviously, when compared to the NBA, there's huge and extreme pay disparities with the WNBA. But you said when people say things like you want equality, that you don't necessarily mean the same money as NBA players, and it's actually more complicated in the sense that you're really talking about equal investment and exposure and really investing in the sport as a whole in a way that hasn't happened before. Can you talk a little bit about this dynamic and how you're looking to break this cycle in terms of lack of investment and lack of opportunity in your sport?
Yeah, I mean, so that's what happens. I feel like it's an easy argument for some people, this easy way to be like, well, you don't deserve the same as the men. Look at the revenue, That's my impersonation. But that's not what we're saying with the WNBA. I feel like in this fight for equal pay, there's all different types of fights. And a lot of times what happens, and obviously I have a front row seat to this, we'll get compared to the US women's soccer team. And that is a different scenario. They're one entity, they're one thing. So to pay the men differently from the women is totally unjust. This is a situation where we're a business. The NBA is a business, the WNBA is a separate business. And what I mean when I say we're not walking into the room and I'm not saying I deserve the same exact money as X, Y, and Z player, it's because it is a business. We understand that. But how do businesses grow? Right? They grow with investment. They grow with exposure, especially with sports. And for women in sports, I mean, the numbers are just insane. They're staggering, the lack of coverage we get. I mean, it's in the single digits. It's like 4% of all media coverage. We only get 4% of that pie. And then recently there was something on Instagram that talked about like ESPN's Instagram page, SportsCenter's Instagram page, Sports Illustrated, Bleacher Report, all of them. And it's like still in the single digits. Female athletes only get, 4 or 5% of that coverage. Those are the things that needs to change in order to have a chance at having a successful business.
You bring up such a good point in terms of when people talk about it being league revenues, that's investment in the sport, it's investment in time and media, and it ultimately becomes this really vicious cycle in terms of making it really challenging to be able to grow the sport and to grow the business. You have spent a lot of time, and your new venture is focused on this as well, really investing on the power of media and representation of the sports. If you don't have that coverage and exposure, you don't have that fan base, and also you don't necessarily have the images of female athletes and the role models, which I know you've talked about being so important. Can you talk about that role of media and why it's such a critical dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, the media controls a lot. I think we all could agree, given how our lives have been the last year. And as it pertains to women in sport, you can't turn on the TV and hear about someone's career or hear a storyline, maybe even hear some drama. That doesn't really exist for our world. Every now and then you might catch a highlight. They might have covered a game and they see like, oh, so-and-so beat so-and-so by 5 points. But you don't get to know the ins and outs. And a lot of what drives sports is those storylines. And I think for a lot of us, we haven't even realized just the consumption we've had for male sports. We know so much about it. But even if you're not a fan, you know so much about it. And so women have really never had that opportunity. And you brought up this production company that I've recently become a part of, founded, called TOGETHXR. And all the things I talked about before, all the percentages, the small amounts. This is our way, the 4 of us, myself, Alex Morgan, Chloe Kim, Simone Manuel, of trying to change that landscape. Because all the things we're talking about, it's optics, it's perception, it's changing that and getting more fans. It's also this aspect of you know, when I was a little kid, I didn't have female athletes to aspire to be. I didn't really see any till I was like 13, 14, 15, you
Which is
know?
crazy, right? Crazy that you didn't have that role model even in the basic level. Yeah, that's unbelievable.
Yeah. So, and I feel like this element right here goes across like all worlds, not just the sports world. It's like, how do you know what you can be if you can't see it, you know? And so I think that's really the goal of Together. It's to get these stories out for all the reasons I just stated.
You're working with three other sort of extraordinary women champions, leaders in their field, and you said if you can't be it, you can't see it. I'd be curious because you're someone who has gone from sort of an extraordinary athlete to an activist and now to a solver, right? In terms of really like putting the where the rubber meets the road in terms of changing these really, really big things. I'd be curious, at what point did you see yourself as that change agent? At what point did you sort of wake up and realize that you were the one who had the opportunity to solve this?
I mean, like yesterday, it's like still this ongoing thing, you know? That's what's, I feel, you know, I'm starting to see the most interesting part about my career isn't necessarily the wins and the losses or the championships. It's that I've been playing for so long. So when I entered the league in 2002, I mean, the league was different. How we were marketing it was different. And really like the vibe of like society was different around women. You know, I don't think I'm saying anything outrageous. And so to see all the change that has happened, to see where we are now, a lot of what I'm doing, I mean, you said activist, which I think is a compliment. I feel like I'm like supporting activism, you know, because activists, it's like its own little job that's so difficult. They deserve so much, so many props because it's so tough. So I feel like, again, what's happening is, I don't know, I look back on my career and I'm like, wait, I knew all these things. I was complaining about these things. I just wasn't saying them. And now we have an opportunity, I think, where women are given more of a microphone, are allowed, which is, I hate saying it that way, but to use their platform more. And now I just feel like, okay, I have all this experience. I've seen so much. I want to be a part of this change, not for me. Like, I'm probably not going to be the beneficiary, which is totally cool. But I want, you know, younger people to have a different set of opportunities than I had. So that's really, it's like legacy almost. Like that's really my driving force.
You make a good point. Sort of now it is such a different dynamic, right, than 20 years ago in terms of even the past few years, right? The conversations around issues of equal pay or representation. So it creates this huge moment. But just because you have a voice and a platform doesn't mean you necessarily use it or feel confident in using it or even know how and where to begin. How did you find your voice to do this? You know, you are obviously really passionate about this. You're someone who knows how to get things done. But was it at all a struggle for you to jump into this new arena?
Like, yes and no. I think, like I said, jokingly, like I was complaining about all this stuff, you know, so behind closed doors, like I had all these opinions, just by nature of having a long career. I do have, you know, I mean, you know, it's like experience. There's something about that. You see it, you understand things differently. And it probably wasn't until meeting Megan, you know, my fiance, Megan Rapinoe, she's obviously very outspoken. And it was interesting because the things we were talking about, like I felt, I believed, I agreed with, I just never thought of myself as somebody speaking out about it. But to see Megan and how she, you know, handles herself, conducts herself, it kind of gave me a little bit of confidence to start talking about these issues. And then simultaneously watching Megan, this is the important part, like Megan studies, you know, and she's researching. It's not like she's sitting down, you know, throwing the glasses on and getting in the encyclopedias. Shout out to the encyclopedia. But she's just constantly consuming. And it was like, okay, I get it. Right? Like if you're going to speak about these issues, yes, I have the experience, I have the knowledge based on my own walk, but I need to be super knowledgeable because when you do speak, you're going to be held accountable for your words. You're going to be asked some tough questions. So that's like a big part of it is just kind of, again, like just constantly consuming and trying to be as knowledgeable as possible.
What's been sort of one of the most surprising or toughest lessons that you've learned in sort of jumping in again to this new world of starting this organization, but using your voice a lot more, not just being frustrated, but really doing something about it? I would imagine that it comes with, and again, you're very familiar with this, right? In terms of peaks and valleys around the experience of how to get it done. What's been surprising to you as a change agent? What have you learned about yourself?
So I think one of the biggest like learning lessons / surprises was, and I think this is kind of like two parts for me. One is this like athlete part where we're kind of, I mean, most recently it's been coined shut up and dribble, but for a long time it was like dumb jock or like, oh, they just play sports, blah, blah, blah. So there's kind of like that gets internalized a little bit over time. And also just as a woman. And I think it's very similar. Women aren't necessarily told to shut up and dribble, but it's kind of like know your role, stay in your lane, that whole vibe. And it was really in our CBA negotiations with the WNBA that I started to really find the strength in my experience and just like the knowledge I did have that was so unique in that room, right? Like I was the only one in that room that had played in the league as long as I had. I'm not talking about players either. I'm talking about like even executives and owners. Like I had been in the WNBA the longest. And I think I walked into the, metaphorical room thinking, oh, everybody must know more than me. Like everybody in here must be smarter. I mean, they're team execs. They have to be, right? It's league owners. They have to be. And it's not about smart, like IQ, it's just about the experience of the WNBA. It's like, oh, they must know more. Oh, they must know more about salaries and salary caps. And after some time of just like listening, not speaking, having opinions, but kind of being like, oh, should I say this? It's kind of going to contradict things. So after a period of that, I started to speak out more, share my opinion more. And with that, I was like, wait a minute, like I can't, and this goes across the board again, like you can't walk in that room and assume everybody's smarter. So that's the lesson I learned. And it's not about assuming you're the smartest, but it's this understanding this is a level playing field. We're all bringing something, and you can't like hold yourself back out of like fear, be intimidated by who may or may not be in like quote unquote that room.
And you make such a good point. I still to this day walk into a room, right, where there's sort of what you think sort of experts, right? People who have sort of years and decades of knowledge. And then you walk out of the room and you're like, wait a second, like I knew something, like I knew more than they did, or that you could add something. It is sort of, sometimes you have to have those moments that shift your confidence or realize that to help you realize and appreciate the value that you can bring and that only you can bring to the table in a way that's so critical. I'd be curious because again, you started using your voice, but you launched together with this really, really big mission to change the narrative around women in sports, to break a lot of the stereotypes, to be able to share the stories that have never gotten told before. How are you thinking about bringing those stories, and what's really important to you right now? At least, again, you're some amazing women have founded this with you, but for you personally, what are the stories and the narratives that you really want to rewrite or expand?
I mean, that's what's so interesting. It's not necessarily about rewriting them. They've never been told. Like, it's like
yes, you're right. That's actually 101. You're right. Yeah.
Because, for me, in my experience, just like as a media, viewer, I put on, I don't, ESPN, it's like the love hate. Cause like they put us on TV, but like we want more. So it's like this constant, but like, you put on ESPN and I kind of touched on this before. What I want to change is boop, you turn the TV on and it's just the highlight. And there's not a lot of knowledge about what's happening. There's no background. And if we want to use the NBA as the comparison, I don't love comparing us to the NBA, but I'll do it for this. If you put that on, I know like what LeBron James had for breakfast. I know, what Damian Lillard, how many kids he has. You just know so much because they talk about it. You have the talking head shows that'll speak about these issues and debate and talk and argue. And you have to know the stories to have shows like that. And those are the shows. I'm not saying they're the end all be all, but it's a part of the landscape that women need to break through. Like we can't just be one highlight. We need to be a talking point. The WNBA this year had so much movement in free agency, like major blockbuster moves, but nobody talks about it. It's like they're there. So that's what Together is. Together is just getting the stories that have always been there and giving them the shine they deserve.
And there's an assumption that the stories aren't being told because there isn't an interest or demand, and we've seen that across so many industries, right? Like, look what's happening in the entertainment industry. And it's funny because I have a young son who has just gotten into football. The football is never on in our house, but I'm amazed how many moments throughout our lives that he has seen it on TV or has exposure to it, and think about collectively over time, sort of the opportunities that are missed and the stories that are missed, but also for, younger generations, as they think about this sport, again, it perpetuates this cycle that you guys are looking to break. When other women are looking at the work that you're doing outside of sports, what do you think are some of the lessons that they can take away from what you're doing? You talked about, which I love, around it, don't be shy about your opinions, and don't assume that everyone's smarter than you. What are some other things that you hope people can take away?
I think along the same lines, you don't want to make that assumption, and simultaneously you also want to have expectations. Like, you want to be expected to be treated equally. You want to be expected to get the same money as your counterpart wherever you work. I think a lot of times, and I use myself, like, I always joke, like, it's like not that funny, but it's kind of funny. Like, I do have some like PTSD from my early years in the WNBA. Like, I should just be thankful to have a job. I shouldn't demand or ask for more. Oh, you're taking this for granted, And it still lives in there sometimes. And what I find this is a great thing, what I find with younger generations is they're like, they expect things. They're like, no, like, what do you mean? Like, we deserve charter flights, or I can't think of an example, but, and I love that. And I feel like a lot of girls can learn from that. A lot of women can learn from that. You have to expect these things. You have to walk into the room and expect them. So I think that's another key point about it. And the last thing I would say is challenge, if something's being done a certain way. I'm big on this. I love doing it in every aspect. Like, wait, why do we do it that way? Like, ask that question, because 9 times out of 10, I'm sure you could attest to this, the answer is, oh, I don't know, we've just always done it that way. And it's like, wait a minute. Like, wait, that can't be the reason, So I find that asking that question and challenging people in that way, it lends to like real, actual change.
You are someone who is a role model for so many in the sports arena and beyond. And you're someone who, given the course of your career, your experience, and the work that you're doing, is such a powerful voice and a powerful agent for change, particularly at this moment where there is so much opportunity to have these discussions, to be able to push forward. I'd be curious, how do you define the term power? What does power mean to you at this point in your life?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think for me, it's where I find power, like in myself. It's definitely in like all the things we've talked about, like kind of getting to the point where I am like embracing them and acknowledging them, like whether it's my experience, whether it's just like the tangible things that I've been able to kind of figure out through time that to use in my leadership skills, like really just like owning them and kind of like, I mean, honestly, it's just being yourself. I guess that's what I'm getting to. You know what I mean? Like, that's what power is. It's like acknowledging like what you're good at, what you're not good at. So I feel like acknowledging what you're good at and really like owning that, acknowledging what maybe you're not so good at and being kind to yourself. Like, don't beat yourself up over it. That's a big part of it. And I think all of those things, it just leads to like authenticity, which is so big. I think authenticity is like the most powerful thing that a person can find within themselves. Cause then that will again lead to like confidence and allow you to, be who you are in the world.
It's the unlock, but I feel like sometimes the things that sound the most simple are the hardest, right? To actually sort of own who you are and to own your strengths and weaknesses. Like, that can take a whole lifetime. And even if you get to the point, you're lucky. But it sounds, again, so seemingly simple, but that is, I think you're right. Sort of the most powerful thing you can do, and the most, extraordinary way to unlock your power. As we wrap up, throughout, the day's conversation, so much of what we're talking about right now is how do people ignite the power in themselves to be a change maker around something that's important to you. Do you have a personal motto or words that you live by for driving change? Something that you say to yourself or you say to others to really ground yourself in this opportunity?
So it's interesting. So my like motto through the years, is pretty simple. I learned it when I was like 16. It's tough times don't last, but tough people do. We've all heard it. That was actually how I found that quote. Was a very close friend of mine in high school was in a bad car accident. Sadly, he was paralyzed. And after like, 7, 8, 9 months of rehab, he's the one that kind of showed me that quote. And that was something he was living by. And that's why I kind of like adopted it. It was both personal, but it also was like, okay, like here's somebody who has this amazing perspective, right? But I think I've been able to use that like in my world of as an athlete, right? Like going through a surgery, tough times don't last, tough people do. But I think it kind of, it touches on a lot of different things. Like you're going to have adversity. There's going to be adversity. This is life. It's going to happen. Life isn't about trying to like snake through and avoid it. Like it's coming. It's really about how you deal with it. Right. And so that's where the tough times don't last, tough people do thing that really hits home for me, because through my career, all the adversity that I've hit, it's totally changed who I am for the better. I've never been the same. If I have a surgery on my knee, I'm not going to be the same player, but that's okay. And I think all of that learning and understanding that in those moments of adversity is where the true growth happens. That can be good personally, but also to your point as like a change agent. Like you can use those things, like understanding when things get tough, like that's when you got to like, tie up those shoes, let's go, because you're going to be better for it on the other side.
Well, last question for you. You've talked about this arc of your career, 20 years, the wins that you've had, the medals, I mean, it's unparalleled. But you mentioned earlier that in thinking about sort of your legacy, it's so much bigger than the sport itself. When someone is looking at your story, you talk about Together being a platform and an opportunity to share more stories. When people look at your story, what's the moral of that story? What's the takeaway that you want them to have in terms of opportunity and the ability to push through to have impact in life?
What's the takeaway? I don't know. I think there's a part of me that's just like, I'm just a kid from Long Island. Like there's nothing, like there was nothing necessarily like special. Obviously I'm a good athlete, but I'm just a kid from Long Island. Like even in my, to be honest, even in my sport, like I'm 5'9". I should be the shortest on my team, but we happen to have somebody who's 5'6". I'm short. Like I'm fast. I'm not the fastest. I'm not jumping higher than anybody. Like all the things that you need to be a good basketball player. Clearly I have the skill and the talent, but some of those other attributes, like I wasn't born with those and yet still found a way, right? Like it might not be the traditional way. Like I like to play more like cerebral. Like I'm thinking out there. That's my strength. So again, I found that strength and I just channeled it. So I think it's just really a story of like somebody who, I don't know, didn't have like everything handed to them in terms of athletic ability, but still found a way.
And I love that, which is why stories like yours need to get told, right? So that people understand that it's not just always one way or sort of one road to follow. And that's so important.
Yeah. The one thing I was going to add is also like, it took me 37 years to find my voice. Like it's not going to happen overnight. Like it took all this time, but now that I have, like, I'm not going to miss another moment. So that's another thing. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not instant success all the time. So you have to stay the course.
But we are so grateful that you have found your voice and the world will be a better place for it. Congratulations on the launch of Together, all the successes to date. And I can't wait to turn on the TV, hopefully very, very soon and see more faces like yours and other amazing athletes. That's so important. So thank you again and really appreciate all that you shared.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.